The markets are already reacting very, very badly to this overnight. So Donald Trump may very well chicken out of this one by noontime tomorrow.
This wasn't how the deal was supposed to end. Just days after President Trump's surprise move to hike tariffs on Canadian imports to a staggering 35%. Both American households and industries are bracing for a wave of price hikes and economic uncertainty rippling across the border. For years, Canadian goods have found a quiet spot on American shelves, from the fridge, stocked with butter and yogurt, to the kitchen filled with sturdy, reliable appliances. On July 21st, that everyday comfort started to feel a little less certain. When President Trump declared a 35% tariff on everything from Canada, talk of billions in trade suddenly came home to the dinner table. It's easy to tune out headlines about markets dipping and currencies sliding, but it's harder to ignore the moment your favorite cheese or that trusty toaster costs a few dollars more. For many middle-aged Americans, this is more than politics. It's about how much it takes to feed a family, or what you can afford to replace when things break down. Experts warn that the prices of imported food and home goods could rise by 6 to 10% over the next year. And as August approaches, it's not just numbers on a spreadsheet, it's a real shift in what everyday life will cost. It's a tense morning in July when Canada's leaders huddled together, mapping out their response. For middle-aged American workers who have built careers in whiskey distilleries, dairy farms, or auto plants, the talk of counter tariffs isn't just a far-off threat, it's a source of quiet anxiety. If Canada follows through, those made-in-America bottles of Tennessee whiskey, blocks of Wisconsin cheese, or Michigan auto parts could face new obstacles crossing the border. Behind every number is a story. A worker clocking in at dawn, a small-town cheese shop hoping the next month won't bring layoffs. As American goods get pricier abroad, families at home may start reaching for more local whiskey and cheese, boosting domestic demand by 3 to 5%. Still, the uncertainty lingers. In towns that rely on these exports, every whisper of a new tariff feels personal. Most folks don't track the Yale Budget Lab, but nearly every family will feel what their numbers predict. With tariffs stacking up, the average American household could find itself paying an extra $2,400 a year just to keep up with the basics: coffee for the morning rush, a new pair of sneakers for the kids, a replacement blender when the old one finally quits. For middle-aged parents juggling bills and busy lives, the impact lands hard. Stagnant paychecks just don't stretch as far when the cost of living climbs. Choices get tougher. Do you cut back on groceries, delay buying that appliance, or hunt for less familiar brands? Some analysts say that, in certain regions, spending on everyday staples could drop by as much as 4%, not because people want to, but because they have no choice. In places like Michigan and Ohio, the hum of the assembly line has been the background music of middle-class dreams for decades. But now, with new tariffs threatening the flow of Canadian steel and auto parts, that music is in danger of going quiet. Suddenly, the cost to build a car could climb by as much as $5,700, a price hike. That's hard to ignore when you're saving for a new ride. For thousands of middle-aged workers on the factory floor, the fear is real. Fewer cars built could mean fewer paychecks, and even part-time hours might get cut back by up to $2,000 a month. Experts warn that car prices could jump 7 to 10% for buyers, making the dream of a new or even used vehicle just a little further out of reach. In the end, the story isn't just about trade policy. It's about whether the next generation will still hear the echo of industry in these towns.
The other problem is that the United States is starting to export less agricultural commodities, and that is a lot in part due to Mr. Trump's trade policies.
You spend months nurturing your crops, only to wake up one morning and realize your entire harvest suddenly has nowhere to go. Sounds ridiculous. But that's exactly what's happening across the American Midwest. As China unexpectedly cancels billions of dollars worth of American soybean orders, setting off a domino effect that threatens U.S. agriculture in the middle of a shifting global trade landscape. There were harvest seasons when Iowa and Illinois soybeans sailed confidently to China, sustaining farm families and small Midwest towns. But this week, everything changed. China abruptly canceled contracts for 2.4 million tons of U.S. soybeans. A $1.1 billion blow, soybean prices plunged 8.2% overnight. Storage bins are now 13% fuller. With no buyers, I've never seen my harvest just sit here with no idea what comes next, says a 53-year-old Iowa farmer. The region faces $470 million in lost revenue, impacting not just big farms, but also groceries, tuition, and savings for thousands of families. If the situation continues, average income for Midwest soybean households could drop another $1,200 to $1,800 this year, and about 4,500 seasonal jobs may vanish before the next harvest. The question lingers: who will buy the beans that have fed this land for generations? Not long ago, American soybeans were China's top choice, with Midwest shipments part of rural life. Now, after over $11 billion in Chinese-backed investment in Brazil's ports and railways, Brazil has taken over. Chinese buyers now pay $14 to $22 more per ton for reliable, long-term supply from Brazil, which provides 70% of China's soybean imports. For many American farmers, this shift isn't just about lost income, it's about being pushed aside in a changing world. This year, U.S. soybean exports to China may drop by up to 10 million tons, about 20%, forcing over 6,000 family farms to cut production or risk bankruptcy. Soybeans were once the ticket to a secure future. Now they are a question mark hanging over tomorrow. Is America still an agricultural powerhouse, or quietly becoming an outsider at the world's export table? It's not just soybeans under pressure, corn. America's golden crop is feeling it too. U.S. corn exports to China have plunged 79% year on year. China also released 1 million more tons from its reserves to cut reliance on U.S. suppliers. For many Midwest farmers, once hopeful fields now bring worry. As corn prices drop and incomes shrink, tough decisions loom about next year's planning and keeping the family farm going. If this trend continues, U.S. corn prices may drop another 10 to 12% in the next 3 months, slashing profits for middle-aged farmers by $900 to $1,500 per household this year. Over 2,000 small farms might suspend operations or cut acreage by 15 to 20% next season. Some changes come quietly by the time you feel them. They're already woven into the fabric of everyday rural life. Every shipload of soybeans now carries more than a harvest. It represents America's global standing. As China and South American partners develop a new trading system, using less dollars and favoring long-term deals, the U.S. role is fading. Without quick investment in infrastructure and modernized supply chains, American farmers could lose their vital spot in the global market. If no major changes happen, U.S. soybean export value may drop another 15 to 20% next year, costing 8,000 to 1,000 jobs in soybean states. Someday we might look back and wonder, was there a time when America's strength was measured by the price of a bushel of soybeans?
Copper will be added to the list, like steel and aluminum, of materials that are taxed at 50% when they are imported into the United States, and that's a big deal.
What if a single decision in early August changes the cost of everything from electric cars to your morning coffee? If the new 50% copper tariff stays in place and cross-border talks stall, could we see higher prices not just in stores, but across the entire American economy? Starting August 1st, President Trump will impose a 50% tariff on all imported copper, including from Canada and other global suppliers. This major move aims to protect the U.S. copper industry, vital to sectors like electric vehicles, clean energy, and defense. However, it also means higher costs for Americans. Products such as electric cars, smartphones, and computers rely heavily on copper, and prices are expected to rise as manufacturers face steeper input costs. Analysts estimate electric vehicle prices may increase by $1,200 to $1,800, with similar effects on electronics and building materials. U.S. factories, especially in auto and energy and defense, could see annual material costs rise by millions, squeezing margins and likely raising consumer prices. Small businesses and contractors, often with less leverage in global supply chains, may face faster rising operating costs. If copper prices remain high, average U.S. households could spend $150 to $200 more annually on copper-related goods, while the industrial sector might absorb up to $3 billion in extra costs by 2026. Prime Minister Carney of Canada has extended trade negotiations until August 1st, gathering provincial leaders and cabinet officials on July 22nd to coordinate a unified response. With strong legal protections now passed for Canada's dairy and poultry sectors, American negotiators face new barriers. This delay in negotiations means that U.S. farmers and food processors may have to wait longer to access Canada's sizable market, especially for dairy and poultry exports. States bordering Canada, home to over 350,000 American agricultural workers, will be watching closely as supply chains adjust. Delayed access could translate into slower sales growth for American producers and potentially higher prices in grocery aisles, as sourcing options remain limited. Industry analysts forecast that if new deals are not reached, American agricultural exports to Canada could fall by 8% in the next 12 months, impacting farm incomes and food industry jobs in the Midwest and Northeast. In a notable shift, Canada has withdrawn its 3% digital services tax to resume negotiations with the U.S. before July 21st. Simultaneously, it is advancing internal trade reforms and forging new ties with the EU, UK, and ASEAN, reducing reliance on the U.S. For Americans, this means rising digital competition. U.S. tech firms may face increased rivalry from European and Asian companies entering North America under new deals. The U.S. currently supplies over 70% of Canada's digital service imports. Losing share could cost up to $500 million annually. Both startups and major tech firms may struggle to maintain pricing power or grow in Canada, potentially impacting jobs and investment in the U.S. Despite President Trump's shifting deadlines and strong rhetoric, Canadian markets have remained steady. The Canadian dollar has dipped only slightly, reflecting investor confidence in Canada's cautious, unified approach, rather than yielding to pressure. Canada is prioritizing internal consensus and quiet diplomacy, a strategy that could gradually weaken U.S. influence in North American trade. If the U.S. fails to secure new concessions, analysts estimate American exporters could lose $2 to $4 billion in trade opportunities over the next 2 years, affecting sectors from manufacturing to agriculture and even pension funds tied to exports.
You don't get a lot of firsts these days, but for the first time, Canadian liquefied natural gas is heading overseas.
Imagine this. You're filling up your gas tank like usual, and the price suddenly jumps by 20 cents, not because of a global crisis, but because Canada decided to shift its export strategy. Mark Carney's government is quietly changing the direction of its oil and gas flows. And the question is, what happens to Americans' wallets if their northern neighbor stops playing by the old rules? The LNG Canada project in Kitimat, British Columbia, with an investment of 40 billion Canadian dollars, around 29.4 billion US dollars, has just sent its first liquefied natural gas, LNG, shipment to South Korea. With an annual capacity of 14 million tons, it's the largest private investment in Canadian history. This could indirectly affect natural gas and power prices in the US, especially in states that rely on LNG piped from the Gulf Coast. If your winter heating bill is usually $120, more Canadian supply could help keep that closer to $115 to $118. The facility began producing LNG in June 2025, and the shipment took only 10 days to reach Asia, half the time compared to US Gulf ports. This time advantage could make Canadian LNG more attractive, potentially reducing demand for US exports and easing domestic prices for power generation. Prime Minister Carney has launched a major project, a new pipeline capable of transporting 1 million barrels of oil per day from Alberta to British Columbia's Prince Rupert Port, bypassing the U.S. refining network. Currently, over 90% of Canadian oil exports go through the U.S., leaving Canada exposed to tariffs and policy shifts. If the pipeline is completed by 2027, much of that oil may head to Asia and Europe instead. U.S. refineries, especially in the Midwest and Northeast, would need to find alternative sources. If Canadian oil now sells at $65 per barrel, switching could add $3 to $5, nudging gasoline prices up 5 to 10 cents per gallon. New Canadian laws are cutting project approval times from 5 years to 2. Carney also requires the pipeline to include a carbon capture and storage system, adding significant cost for U.S. drivers. That means fuel prices could rise gradually, perhaps 3 to 5 cents per gallon as early as this fall if refineries must adjust quickly. The U.S. is producing oil at record levels, 13.4 million barrels per day in July 2025, but still processes much of Canada's exports. Once Canada shifts more oil to Asia, supply for U.S. refineries tightens. That could push gas prices up by 10 to 20 cents per gallon in states like Ohio, Michigan, and New England, which depend on Canadian heavy crude. If you currently pay $3.5 per gallon, expect that to edge closer to $3.7. Adding to that, a new 10% U.S. tax on Canadian energy imports could raise prices by another 20 to 30 cents per gallon. That squeezes household budgets, especially for families already balancing fuel and heating costs. Refineries would need new suppliers, since 60% of imported U.S. oil comes from Canada. Switching sources means higher costs and added pressure on operations. That could raise auto service prices, oil changes, and parts may get more expensive, increasing overall car ownership costs. If Canada keeps redirecting supply and U.S. tariffs stay in place, the U.S. may rely more on Venezuela or Iraq, where production and transport are pricier. Fuel prices could climb another 15 to 20 cents per gallon, raising everyday costs one tank at a time.
Now, according to the U.S. Travel Association, even a 10% drop in Canadian tourists could cost the U.S. more than $2 billion in spending and threaten 140,000 jobs.
You walk into an airport that once buzzed with crowds and excitement. Now, you find rows of empty seats, silent hallways, and closed check-in counters. Sounds dramatic. This is the new reality at America's busiest airports, as airlines and travelers quietly turn away from the United States. There was a time when America's biggest airports bustled, tourists rushing, constant boarding calls, but since early 2025, over 10 major airlines, including Singapore Airlines, Lufthansa, Emirates, Air France, Play airlines have quietly cut flights to the U.S. without major announcements. Now, silence lingers at O'Hare, LAX, and JFK, emptier waiting areas, fewer staff at check-in, and departure boards crowded with canceled routes. In cities like Chicago and New York, the numbers start to feel real. With 85,000 jobs at risk, families are rethinking how to pay the mortgage, keep up with college savings, or cover medical expenses for aging parents. This isn't just about a drop in tourism. It's a wave shaking the foundations of daily life, sometimes leaving the dinner table quieter, and plans for the future more uncertain. With job losses and shrinking incomes, an average family may have to cut $100 from the monthly grocery budget, often buying less fresh meat, milk, or produce. Multiply that by 85,000 workers. And local retailers and food suppliers feel the ripple, making entire cities more cautious. Higher landing fees, complicated visa procedures, and frosty welcomes at border checkpoints have made even the dream of coming to America less certain. These days, even a pricey business class ticket doesn't guarantee easy entry. Every shift cut, every lost dollar, weighs heavier when there are bills to pay and kids asking for new shoes. With fewer hotel guests, staff see their hours cut sometimes by as much as 6 hours per week. That's $240 a month, money that once covered groceries, summer camps, or a weekend meal to unwind from the stress. If this continues, hotel and restaurant workers may need to tighten their budgets even further. Shopping for fresh meat, fish, and vegetables might shrink by up to 20%. That's $50 to $100 less per month for every family working in these industries. Not long ago, travelers from Scandinavia, Korea, the UK, and France would visit America touring colleges, attending conferences, or seeking a new kind of summer. Now, they're picking Canada or Japan, which seem more open and welcoming. With everyday essentials, sales expected to drop by $60 million this year. Shop owners face tough choices: cut staff hours, reduce orders, or explain slimmer margins to employees. Shelves aren't empty, but aisles often are, making it hard to plan or invest. As international visitors vanish, local milk sales could drop 15 to 20% from last year. Store owners may lose $1,000 to $2,000 in monthly revenue, affecting fresh product quality and supply. and possibly raising prices if supply chains struggle. In past years, city lights in places like New York or Miami burned bright, thanks to international visitors renting short-term apartments, packing coffee shops, bringing energy to every corner. Now, as British Airways, Lufthansa, and Jetstar all reduce flights, 1.5 million visits simply vanish. Short-term apartment rents in former gateways to America are dropping by an average of $200 per month. For tenants, it sounds like a win. But for landlords who relied on that income to pay debt or cover medical bills, it's nearly $50 million in lost revenue. Quietly, faith in the American dream slips a little more, not just in the eyes of the world, but even for those who once thought they'd finally found stability. The U.S. is facing a dramatic decline in international tourism, with ripple effects felt by millions of Americans. How might shrinking visitor numbers quietly reshape the future of your town? In 2025, international visitor spending in the U.S. is projected to drop by 7%, which translates to a loss of $12.5 billion compared to the previous year and stands at only 78% 2019 peak, according to the U.S. Travel Association. In March 2025 alone, arrivals of foreign tourists fell 14%, raising the possibility of a $21 billion loss if this trend continues throughout the year. This is not just a dip in numbers. These are visitors who fill hotel rooms, eat in restaurants, and shop in American stores. For millions of Americans, the impacts are already close to home. Hundreds of thousands of jobs in hotel, restaurants, travel services, and support sectors now hang in the balance. In smaller tourist towns, where local budgets depend on outside visitors, falling income has already triggered reductions in healthcare, education, and social services. Families in these communities are finding it harder to access essential public services, all because fewer international travelers are spending money in their areas. Looking ahead, experts caution that unless there's a dramatic turnaround, U.S. destinations could face long-term challenges in regaining their pre-pandemic position in global tourism. Persistent declines could mean further job losses, reduced tax revenue, and a slow erosion of vital community services nationwide. Without bold steps to revive tourism, millions of Americans may continue to feel the economic pinch for years to come. There is a growing call for policymakers to consider new strategies, like streamlined visa processes and marketing efforts, to boost America's appeal to international travelers. Travelers from Canada and Mexico are changing their plans, with visitor numbers down about 20% in early 2025. According to the International Air Transport Association, bookings on Canada, U.S. routes have plunged by 70 to 76%. Western European travelers, especially from the UK, Germany, and France, have dropped by 17 to 30%. Meanwhile, Australian arrivals have also sharply declined. Several governments, including Canada, the UK, and China, have issued public safety advisories, urging their citizens to reconsider trips to the U.S. due to concerns over security and stricter entry policies. For Americans, these choices have direct and visible effects. In cities like New York, the loss of up to 3 million foreign tourists could mean a $4 billion hit to the local tourism industry this year. Along the border, duty-free shops and cross-border transport services report revenue drops of over 40 to 80%, leading to significant job cuts in those areas. These are not abstract numbers. These are lost jobs, shuttered businesses, and reduced family incomes across the country. Experts warn that if current travel advisories and policies remain unchanged, the U.S. could lose even more ground in the competition for global tourists. American communities that depend on Canadian, European, and Asian visitors may struggle for years to rebuild, risking long-term unemployment and slower economic recovery. Calls are growing for American cities and tourism boards to coordinate international outreach and improve the visitor experience, hoping to reverse the downward trend. Soaring inflation has driven up the price of airfares, hotels, and dining out, making vacation dreams unaffordable for many Americans. Recent surveys by the U.S. Travel Association reveal that nearly half of American travelers are cutting back on their vacation spending. For many, the sentiment is summed up by one expert's wry observation. Americans no longer plan vacations. Now they just hope they can afford a burrito. This trend hits local economies especially hard during what should be the busy summer season. Hotels, amusement parks, car repair shops, and souvenir stands are all feeling the sting. Workers in the domestic tourism industry face reduced hours or even layoffs as American families pull back on their travel plans. Many seasonal workers who rely on summer tourism for their income now find themselves with fewer shifts and lower earnings. If prices remain high, industry analysts predict continued sluggish demand for domestic travel throughout 2025. That means even more pressure on local businesses, a weaker job market in travel-dependent communities, and lasting changes in how Americans choose to spend their free time and money. Families may have to seek more affordable leisure options close to home, altering long-standing traditions of summer vacations and family road trips. This downturn is not driven by another wave of COVID-19. Instead, it is a crisis of confidence. U.S. visa policies, ongoing trade disputes, and a global image of America as less welcoming have led many would-be visitors to look elsewhere. Major financial institutions, such as J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs, have warned that the U.S. tourism sector is unraveling. As travelers opt for destinations they perceive as safer and friendlier. For ordinary Americans, this trust crisis hits hardest in states like Florida, Nevada, New York, and Illinois. Communities in these regions are experiencing falling revenues, job insecurity, and concerns over future retirement funds as tourism dollars disappear. Beyond the immediate job losses, there is a growing sense of unease about the nation's reputation abroad. The decline in visitor trust not only damages the Made in USA brand, but also shakes America's standing as a global economic leader, raising new questions about national safety and responsibility. Experts suggest that unless America restores its reputation for openness and reliability, international tourism could remain depressed well into the future, with consequences for jobs, community stability, and the country's economic influence on the world stage. Observers stress that efforts to rebuild trust and create a more welcoming environment must begin now if the U.S. hopes to regain its place at the center of global travel. Experts see continued turbulence for both international and domestic tourism, with no quick fix on the horizon. Now is the time for Americans to rethink, adapt, and support both local businesses and policies that can help rebuild trust and opportunity for everyone.